Rare spawns have been a part of World of Warcraft since its release in 2004, and while there are some exceptions, rare NPCs can generally be characterized by their slower than normal respawn time, which as a result makes them more rare to come by, and hence their name. To most players, a rare NPC is a welcome sight, especially for those who are still leveling their character, and this is because they give way more experience than regular NPCs, as well as dropping additional gear and often resources. Something that's been the case since the Burning Crusade expansion from 2007. But in the original version of the game, often called vanilla, rares were a lot less predictable, with some of them being impossible to attack for Alliance players, some of them dropping quest items, while others didn't drop anything at all. Even their rarity itself was up to debate, and not in terms of how often they spawn, but literally whether or not they were actually rare type NPCs. In this video, we will explore the strange ways that rare spawn used to work in the game's very first version. This is the rares of vanilla. When players stepped into Azeroth for the first time, they soon encountered rare mobs, who usually dropped green quality items, with some of them occasionally dropping a rare quality item. They would also sometimes drop quest items, which made sense in terms of story, but due to the mobs' long and often random respawn time, they weren't ideal in terms of gameplay, as players were forced to wait, sometimes for hours, if they wanted to complete the entire storyline of the zone that they were in. When the game's next expansions released, rares would no longer drop quest items, likely due to the frustrations that it caused players throughout vanilla. While most of the items that rare dropped were pretty weak, especially compared to the level of the rare dropping them, there were a few items that players found extremely useful, so much so that they went out of their way to get them. One of the most extreme examples of this is the rare spawn named Prince Nashak, a level 41 Naga NPC that could be found around a shipwreck at the coast of Arathi Highlands. He had a chance to drop the title charm, a level 36 trinket slot item that stunned the target for 3 seconds on use. This made the item a must-have for player versus player encounters, where stunning the target for 3 seconds heavily outweighs the penalty of missing the stats of a high level trinket. As a result, a lot of high level players camped the area, something that was repeated in the 2019 classic version of the game, where the prince was even more contested than it had previously been in the original vanilla version. Something that classic players only got to experience partly was the search for rare hunter pets. This is because, contrary to later expansions, where rare hunter pets have unique appearances, rare spawns actually used to have some unique stats that they would retain even after the hunter had tamed them. In classic World of Warcraft, the most dedicated of hunters will camp for hours, sometimes even days, for a cat named Broken Tooth, a level 37 rare cat that spawns around the northern part of the Badlands zone. The reason for this is that Broken Tooth has a very high attack speed of 1 attack each second, which, although being partly compensated by lower damage for each individual hit, it still has the highest overall damage output, as well as making it difficult for opponents to cast spells in PvP due to the pushback, which makes Broken Tooth a must for hunters trying to optimize their character to the fullest. What few players know is that in the original version from 2004, the best hunter pet was actually not Broken Tooth, but another rare beast named Lupus, who can occasionally be found around the zone of Duskwood. Unlike Broken Tooth, Lupus has a very slow attack speed, which on its own would make him quite weak. But Lupus' power didn't lie in the damage or the attack speed, but rather how the damage was dealt. Where other beasts deal physical damage, which is mitigated by armor, a stat that every creature and player has to some degree, Lupus' attacks would instead be dealt as shadow damage, which made him bypass all armor, only being reduced by shadow resistance, which few NPCs and even fewer players had any meaningful amount of. Due to the massive difference between the power level of Lupus and other hunter pets at the time, he was eventually changed to deal physical damage just like every other pet, which nerfed him from being the best hunter pet by a large margin to being one of the worst because he kept a slow attack speed of just 1 attack every 2 seconds. As this change was made in patch 1.9, just over a year after the game's release, Lupus doesn't deal shadow damage in the classic version of the game, which is why Broken Tooth is now the strongest pet available to hunters. While most players take it for granted that they can attack all of the rare spawns they come across, this wasn't always the case, as in the original game, as well as in World of Warcraft Classic, some rares were part of a faction, meaning that unless players were at war with the faction, the rare spawn was impossible to attack and kill. There has only been 2 rares who were part of one of the game's neutral factions. One of them, Orm the Wise, was a member of the Cenarian Circle faction, which posed a problem for players who wanted to attack him, and this is because the Cenarian Circle was innately neutral, and therefore players could only attack him if they had turned on the at war toggle with the faction. This probably doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is required for the player to have interacted with the faction prior to meeting the rare, and players who hadn't looked on in frustration as their excitement of finally finding a rare turned into disappointment that they couldn't do anything. The other neutral rare, called Gatekeeper Rage War, didn't have this problem, as he was part of the Timbermoor Hold faction, who players are innately at war with. And in the event that the player had completed the quest required to make the Timbermoor Hold faction friendly, by doing so they would of course already have interacted with the faction, which gave them the option to turn on the at war toggle and then attack him. Unlike Orm the Wise, killing Gatekeeper Rage War decreased the player's reputation with his faction, the Timbermoor Hold. There were also rare spawns that were members of the Alliance, meaning that only Horde players could attack them. The most well-known of these, especially to those playing on one of the hardcore realms, are the Alliance Outrunners, a patrol consisting of 4 elite rares with levels ranging from 24 to 25, who would occasionally be found patrolling in the southern part of the Barrens Zone. Interestingly, one of the Alliance-friendly rares, a dwarf named Duggan Wildhammer, can actually be attacked by Alliance players, but this is provided that the player is playing a dwarf character. The reason for this is that Duggan is a member of the Wildhammer clan, which, although being friendly to the Alliance, still has the at war toggle for dwarf players. This is due to the Wildhammer clan having a troubled relationship with the Dwarves of Ironforge in World of Warcraft's lore. When the game first launched, every Alliance race could initially declare war on the Wildhammer clan, but this was changed in patch 1.5, after which all races apart from dwarves lost that option. In the classic era version of the game, while the Wildhammer clan still exists in their old Airy Peak version, only dwarves still have the option to turn on the at war toggle, reflecting the change made in patch 1.5 of the original vanilla. Those who have played during the original vanilla from 2004 to 2006 may remember hearing the phrase Silver Elites, which is a community-given name for rares, one that is likely based on the icons of rare NPCs, as these have a border that portray a wingless silvery dragon, as compared to elites whose border portray a winged golden dragon. While you may still occasionally see old school players refer to rares as Silver Elites, the phrase largely died down when the Burning Crusade expansion launched, seeing as this is when rare elites finally got their own distinct icon, which is shown as a fully winged silvery dragon. Prior to this point, only rares had a silver dragon around their icon, while rare elites had a winged golden dragon, just as if they had been regular elites. And there was actually no way to tell the two apart unless the player already knew, or if they had an add-on, which brings us to VanCleef, the final boss of the Deadmines dungeon. Depending on who you ask, VanCleef is either a rare elite or simply an elite. And the reason for this is that due to a bug, VanCleef is incorrectly shown as a rare elite, something that players will not notice unless they use an add-on or look him up on one of the game's databases. While Edwin himself isn't really a rare elite, this isn't to say that bosses can't be, as there are a number of these where their rarity lies in them only having a chance to be present in the dungeon, and this is decided when the first player enters the dungeon and creates the instance ID. Interestingly, VanCleef is not the only non-rare NPC that is labeled as rare. There are a few others, such as the Razorfin Spearheads, but of the few NPCs that have this trait, VanCleef is by far the most well known. If you play the classic version of the game, VanCleef still has this bug, just like he had in the original vanilla, but in the Burning Crusade, he was fixed to be an elite just like he was intended. And finally, in the Cataclysm expansion, he was removed from the game, after which he would go on to be remembered as one of the game's most iconic final bosses.